He never expected his quiet afternoon at Blake's corner store in the small town of Crestwood to turn into a showdown that would expose a criminal empire. But when 5 members of the notorious Black Wolves motorcycle gang decided to harass a man in a wheelchair, they had no idea they were messing with one of the military's most lethal combat specialists. Alexander Hayes had spent years hiding his true identity, masking his abilities behind the facade of a disabled veteran. The wheelchair wasn't a lie. An IED in Afghanistan had taken his legs. But what these bikers didn't know was that he was now an undercover FBI agent investigating their multi-million-dollar weapons trafficking operation. They thought they saw weakness. They saw a target. They circled him like vultures, laughing, taunting, pushing his chair, spilling his groceries. But when their leader, Trevor, the Snake, Morrison, laid his hands on Alexander's shoulders, something snapped. In less than 30 seconds, 3 bikers were on the ground. One was unconscious, and their leader was staring down the barrel of his own gun, now firmly in Alexander's grip. What happened next would send shockwaves through the criminal underworld as one man's quest for justice would dismantle the largest weapons trafficking ring in the Pacific Northwest. Alexander Hayes wheeled himself steadily along the cracked sidewalk of Main Street in Crestwood, Montana. His movements were precise and measured. The familiar weight of his concealed Sig Sauer pressed against his lower back, hidden beneath his casual jacket. 3 years in this chair had taught him to adapt and modify every combat technique he'd learned in the military. The wheels weren't a weakness. They were just another tool. His wheelchair was custom-modified with hidden compartments and advanced technology, including a remote control for various gadgets. Sophia's voice drifted from the cafe doorway. "Alex, your usual?" The young cafe owner's smile was genuine. One of the few real connections Alexander had allowed himself to make in this town. "Thanks, Sophia. It's been one of those days." Alexander maneuvered his chair through the entrance, automatically noting exits, sight lines, potential cover. Old habits died hard. His secure phone buzzed. Agent Cooper's 3rd message today. The weapon shipment they had been tracking was coming in soon. The Black Wolves were getting sloppy, confident. That's why Alexander was here, playing the role of a broken veteran in a small Montana town. Nobody looked twice at him, and that's exactly what made him dangerous. The cafe door chimed. Alexander's reflection in the window showed 3 men entering, their leather vests bearing Black Wolf's patches. His heart rate stayed steady as he sipped his coffee. This wasn't the first time they crossed paths, but something felt different today. The energy was wrong. "Well, look who it is." Trevor Morrison's voice carried across the cafe. "Our favorite local hero." The gang leader's mock respect dripped with venom. 2 more wolves entered behind him, spreading out in a familiar tactical pattern that made Alexander's combat instincts fire. "Evening, Trevor." Alexander kept his voice neutral, his wheelchair angled for quick movement. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Trevor stepped closer, his breath reeking of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. "You know what I can't figure out?" He leaned down, invading Alexander's space. "How someone like you manages to always be around when we're doing business. It's almost like you're watching us." The other patrons were quietly slipping out, leaving only Sophia behind the counter, her hand likely on the silent alarm. Alexander could take all 5 men. He'd run the scenarios 100 times, but it would blow his cover, months of investigation wasted. "I live here, Trevor. Small town." Alexander shrugged, playing the role he'd perfected. "Not many places to be." Rick Razor Thompson, Trevor's right-hand man, circled behind Alexander's chair. "Maybe we should help you find somewhere else to be." "Sweetheart, accidents happen to people in chairs all the time." Alexander's fingers tightened imperceptibly on his armrest. One quick move Alexander could dislocate Razor's knee. The modified Krav Maga techniques he developed worked perfectly from a seated position, but he held back, remembering Cooper's words, "The weapons bust is everything. We need the whole network." Trevor grabbed Alexander's chair handles, spinning him to face him. "You've got 1 day to leave town. After that," he grinned, revealing gold-capped teeth. "Well, let's just say we know people at the VA. Benefit checks can get lost real easy." The old Alexander would have put him down right there. But 3 years of undercover work had taught him patience. Sometimes, you had to lose the battle to win the war. He let fear show in his eyes, just enough to be convincing. I, I understand, he looked down, hating the tremor he forced into his voice. Please, I don't want any trouble. Trevor straightened, satisfied. Smart boy. Boys, let's show him what trouble looks like anyway. He nodded to Mike, Crusher Davis, the gang enforcer. Crusher grinned, reaching for Alexander's chair. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Alexander saw everything with crystal clarity. Sophia reaching for the phone, Trevor's smug smile. The way Crusher's weight was shifted forward, leaving him vulnerable. He could end this in seconds. Instead, he forced himself to flinch as Crusher grabbed his chair and tilted it, spilling him onto the floor. Coffee splashed across the tiles. The gang's laughter echoed off the walls as Alexander lay there, playing helpless, burning their faces into his memory. Each one would pay, but not today. Today, he was building their confidence, letting them think they were untouchable. He'd learned in Afghanistan that the deadliest predators were patient. Oops. Crusher laughed. Looks like someone needs one of those I've fallen and I can't get up buttons. Alexander struggled to right himself, making it look difficult. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, but the mission came first. It always had. As he finally pulled himself back into his chair, Trevor leaned down one last time. Remember, one day, then we stop being nice. He straightened Alexander's chair with mocked courtesy. Let's roll. Boys, our friend here needs to pack. The Black Wolves swaggered out, leaving behind the stench of leather and cruelty. Only when their motorcycles roared away did Alexander let his mask slip slightly. Sophia rushed over with a towel, her face flushed with anger. Alexander, I'm so sorry. I called Chief Anderson. He's on his way. Those bastards can't just... It's okay. Sophia. Alexander's voice was steady now, his eyes hard as he watched the bikes disappear around the corner. Everything's exactly the way it needs to be. His phone buzzed again. Cooper. The weapon shipment was confirmed for tonight. The Wolves had just made their biggest mistake, but they didn't know it yet. They thought they'd intimidated a helpless man. Instead, they'd given him the perfect excuse to be anywhere in town, watching them under the guise of leaving. Alexander smiled slightly as he dried himself off. Sometimes the best weapon was letting your enemy think they already won. Night had fallen over Crestwood as Alexander wheeled himself into his small ranch house on the outskirts of town. The modest home, carefully chosen for its clear sight lines and multiple escape routes, had been his base of operations for the past 3 years. He locked the door, ran his usual security checks, then finally allowed his shoulders to relax. The burner phone hidden in his chair's compartment buzzed. Agent Cooper's voice was tense when he answered. Tell me you didn't engage them. Hayes. Relax. David. I played my part perfectly. Alexander moved to his computer setup hidden behind a false wall panel. They did exactly what we expected. Try to run me out of town. The weapon shipment is definitely coming tonight. My source says it's big. Military-grade hardware bound for cartel buyers in Mexico. We can't afford any mistakes. Alexander's jaw tightened. They threatened to mess with my VA benefits. David. Real original. Should have seen their faces. So proud of themselves for intimidating the poor, helpless veteran. Cooper's tone held a warning. I know. The mission comes first. Alexander muttered, pulling up surveillance photos of the Wolves' compound. But when this is over, I'm going to teach them some manners. After ending the call, Alexander wheeled to his bedroom, transferring himself onto the bed with practiced ease. His legs, or what remained of them, ached with phantom pain, a reminder of that day in Afghanistan that had changed everything. The memories flooded back unbidden, his team moving through the dusty streets of Kandahar, children playing nearby, the flash of metal that caught his eye, an IED trigger man in a window. He'd had a choice: take the shot from his position or run into the open to warn the kids. It wasn't really a choice at all. The explosion had taken his legs, but he'd saved 12 children. The military had called him a hero and awarded him medals. Then they'd quietly approached him about a new mission. His injuries made him the perfect undercover agent, Who would suspect a disabled veteran of being one of the FBI's top operatives? A noise outside snapped him back to the present. Footsteps on gravel. Too deliberate to be casual. Alexander reached for his gun, then heard a familiar whistle. Sophia. Brought you some dinner, the cafe owner said when Alexander opened the door. And information. She wheeled inside quickly, locking up behind her. The wolves haven't changed their plans. Trevor was bragging at the bar about some big delivery happening at the old lumber mill tonight. Around midnight. Alexander nodded. Sophia had been his eyes and ears in town from the beginning. One of the few people who knew his true identity. You're taking a risk helping me like this. Those bastards killed my brother 2 years ago. A bad batch of drugs they were pushing. Police called it an overdose. But I know better. Sophia's eyes hardened. Besides, somebody needs to stand up to them. As they ate, Alexander's mind worked through scenarios. The lumber mill had too many access points to cover with standard FBI teams. But if the wolves were expecting him to leave town, they'd be less cautious. He could use that. I need you to do something for me tomorrow, Sophia. Alexander said finally, something that might seem strange. Sophia leaned forward. Name it. I need you to help me spread the word that I'm leaving town. Make it convincing. Pack some boxes in your truck. Make a show of helping me move. A diversion. Alexander smiled. They'll be watching. We need them confident, distracted. When they see me loading up, they'll think they've won. Later that night, after Sophia left, Alexander transferred back to his chair and moved to the hidden wall panel behind it. Alongside his computers hung a modified tactical vest. He'd spent months adapting his combat gear to work from a seated position. Every strap, every pocket was positioned for maximum efficiency. His phone buzzed again, a text from Cooper. Teams in position by 2300 hours tonight. Don't engage early. Alexander texted back a simple acknowledgement, then began his preparations. He checked his weapons, reviewed the lumber mill blueprints, and ran through his adapted combat moves. The wolves had no idea that every insult, every threat today had only made him more dangerous. When you've lost your legs, you learn that true strength isn't in standing tall. It's in knowing when to appear weak. He wheeled to his window, watching the stars over the Montana mountains. Tonight would change everything. Either he'd bring down one of the largest weapons trafficking operations in the country, or he'd blow 3 years of deep cover work. And if things went wrong, his wheelchair wouldn't be an excuse, it would be his coffin. The phantom pain returned, stronger this time. Alexander closed his eyes, remembering the hospital after the explosion. The doctors had told him he'd never serve again, never run again, never fight again. They didn't understand that taking his legs had only made him more determined. The wolves had made the same mistake today, assuming that his disability made him weak. His phone lit up with another message, this one from an unknown number. A photo appeared. Alexander at the cafe today. On the ground after Crusher had tipped his chair. The caption read, "Tonight is your last chance." Alexander smiled coldly in the darkness. The wolves thought they were hunters, but they had no idea what was hunting them. Tonight, they would learn that the deadliest predator is the one they never see coming. He began his final equipment check. Each piece of gear had been modified, tested, perfected. His wheelchair itself was a weapon, reinforced frame, hidden compartments, custom modifications that turned it from a medical device into a combat platform. Anyone who looked at him saw weakness. They never noticed the warrior hiding in plain sight. He had also prepared small EMP devices disguised as medical gadgets, which he had developed during his time undercover, knowing they would be crucial in combat scenarios. These devices, controlled by a remote system integrated into his wheelchair, could disable electronics, giving him a tactical advantage. The night deepened as Alexander ran through his mental preparations. Tonight would require perfect timing, perfect control. One mistake and the whole operation would collapse. But he'd been training for this moment since the day he'd woken up in that hospital bed. The wolves thought they'd scared him into running. Instead, they'd given him exactly what he needed, an excuse to be anywhere in town, watching their every move. As he finally prepared for bed, Alexander thought about Sophia's brother, about all the lives the wolves had destroyed with their operation. Tonight wasn't just about the weapons bust, it was about justice, about showing that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one they've already dismissed. He set his alarm, knowing that in a few hours, everything would change. The Wolves were about to learn a lesson about underestimating their enemies. And Alexander Hayes, the disabled veteran they'd mocked, would be their teacher. Dawn broke over Crestwood with a blood-red sky. Alexander watched the sunrise from his porch, sipping black coffee as he observed two of Trevor's men trying to be inconspicuous in their surveillance of his house. They'd been there since early morning, parked in a blue pickup truck, thinking they were invisible. Amateur hour. His secured tablet displayed the latest intelligence from Cooper. The weapon shipment was massive, enough firepower to supply a small army, RPGs, modified assault rifles, even prototype military hardware that wasn't supposed to exist outside of classified facilities. The question that had been nagging at him for months remained. How were the Wolves getting their hands on this level of equipment? The burner phone rang. Alexander, we've got movement. Sophia's voice was hushed. Trevor just had a meeting with someone at the diner. Suit and tie type. Definitely not local. They passed something under the table. Description: mid-50s. Military bearing. Expensive watch. Seemed real interested in the lumber mill delivery. Called Trevor's son a couple of times. Alexander's mind raced. The missing piece was starting to form. Sophia, I need you to get that coffee ready. Our plan starts now. An hour later, Alexander wheeled down Main Street, making sure the Wolves' surveillance team had a clear view. He'd packed 2 large boxes on his lap, making a show of struggling with them. Right on cue, Sophia pulled up in her pickup truck, bed already loaded with furniture. Last load. Alexander. Sophia called out loudly enough for everyone to hear. I can't believe you're really leaving, she continued. No choice. Alexander projected defeat into his voice. Can't stay where I'm not wanted. They played their parts perfectly, the concerned friend helping the intimidated veteran pack up and leave town. Alexander caught glimpses of phones being used, messages being sent. The Wolves were buying it, spreading the word that they'd successfully driven him out. By noon, half the town had heard he was leaving. Alexander wheeled into the cafe one last time, keeping up appearances. The place was unusually busy. It seemed like everyone wanted to say goodbye to the disabled veteran who had become a familiar sight over the past 3 years. Chief Anderson approached his table, coffee in hand. He was one of the few who knew Alexander's true identity, essential backup for what was coming. Heard you're skipping town, he said loudly enough to be overheard, then much quieter. Teams are in position. Coast Guard intercepted the decoy shipment they sent up north. Alexander nodded slightly, maintaining his defeated expression. Sometimes you just know when you're not welcome anymore. Chief. The bell chimed as Trevor and Razor walked in, their timing too perfect to be coincidence. They wanted to witness their victory firsthand. Alexander felt Razor's eyes on him, watching for any sign that this was an act. He gave him what he wanted, a flinch, a quick look away, hands trembling slightly on his wheels. Moving day. Huh. Trevor swaggered over, clearly enjoying himself. Smart choice. He leaned down, voice dropping to a whisper. But just to make sure you don't get lost on your way out, he slipped a phone into Alexander's lap. Keep it on you. We'll be checking, a tracking device. Alexander had expected something like this. Please, he let his voice crack. I'm leaving just like you wanted. Of course you are. Trevor straightened, smirking. Boys, help the lady pack up. Let's make sure he gets everything. Crusher and Tommy Ghost, Parker appeared at his sides, their helpful gestures carrying clear threats. They followed him and Sophia back to the house, watching as they loaded the last few boxes. Alexander had prepared for this, making sure they saw exactly what he wanted them to see. Clothes, photos, personal items, all carefully staged. As afternoon faded into evening, Alexander made his final appearance on Main Street. The Wolves' surveillance had relaxed, confident in their victory. He'd seen Trevor checking the tracking phone twice, watching his dot move exactly as expected. What they didn't know was that the phone was now attached to Sophia's truck, heading north on the highway. Meanwhile, Alexander's real operation was about to begin. Back in his house, he activated the hidden panel revealing his tactical gear. The lumber mill security cameras, compromised months ago, showed increased activity, trucks moving in and out, wolves setting up for the midnight delivery. They were so focused on watching him leave town, they never noticed the careful positioning of FBI teams, the subtle movement of local police into strategic locations. His secure phone lit up with a message from Cooper, confirmation on your mystery man, Robert Sullivan, former Army colonel, dishonorably discharged 3 years ago after an investigation into missing weapons. Never prosecuted. The pieces clicked into place. Sullivan was their source, a bitter ex-military officer with access codes and contacts, using the wolves as his distribution network. His appearance today wasn't an accident. He was overseeing the biggest shipment yet. Alexander began his final preparations. The modified tactical vest slid on smoothly, each piece of equipment precisely where he needed it. His wheelchair, stripped of its civilian disguise, now showed its true nature: reinforced frame, puncture-proof tires, hidden compartments holding enough firepower to take down a small army. The sun was setting as he ran through his mental checklist one last time. The wolves thought he was running scared, already miles away on the highway north. Instead, he was about to become their worst nightmare. His phone buzzed, a message from Trevor to the tracking phone. Keep driving. Sweetheart, don't stop until you hit Canada. Alexander smiled in the growing darkness. The wolves had spent all day watching him leave, never realizing they were the ones being watched. In a few hours, their empire would crumble. They learned too late that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one they've already dismissed. The real operation was about to begin. Darkness settled over the lumber mill like a shroud. Alexander positioned himself in the shadows of an abandoned office building, his wheelchair completely silent on the gravel thanks to its special modifications. Through his night vision scope, he counted 12 wolves patrolling the perimeter, all armed with military-grade weapons. They'd stepped up their security tonight. Sullivan's influence. No doubt. Control. I have eyes on the primary entrance, he whispered into his secure calm. Multiple tangos. Heavy weapons. They're expecting trouble. Cooper's voice crackled in his ear. Sullivan just arrived. Black SUV. Diplomatic plates. He's not even trying to hide anymore. Alexander watched Sullivan emerge from his vehicle, his military bearing obvious even at this distance. He walked like a man who'd never lost his command presence, inspecting the wolves' setup with clear disapproval. Trevor trailed behind him, trying to look important. The shipment late? Sullivan's voice carried clearly through Alexander's directional microphone. Your people better not have screwed this up, Trevor. The buyers aren't known for their patience. Relax, old man, Trevor replied, lighting a cigarette. Ghost is escorting them in personally. 20 minutes tops. Alexander's mind raced. Ghost wasn't at the mill, which meant the real shipment was coming from a different direction. The convoy they were all watching for was a decoy. Cooper, he whispered, check the back roads near Miller's Creek. Ghost would use the old logging trails. On it. A pause. Damn, you're right. Thermal imaging shows 3 trucks moving through the forest. They're bypassing all our checkpoints. Alexander smiled grimly. The wolves weren't completely amateur after all. But their clever route had a fatal flaw. It would force them to cross open ground between the tree line and the mill's loading dock. Perfect. He began moving, his wheelchair absolutely silent as he repositioned. Years of training had taught him to use terrain to his advantage, and his lower profile in the chair actually helped him stay hidden. The wolves were all looking for threats at standing height. Nobody thought to check ground level. A new voice crackled over his comm. Agent Hayes. This is Team Bravo. We've got movement at the north end. 4 SUVs. Cartel. The buyers. Alexander confirmed. Right on schedule. Hold position until my mark. Sullivan was getting agitated, checking his watch repeatedly. Where the hell is Ghost? The buyers are here. Patience. Colonel. Trevor sneered, emphasizing the rank Sullivan no longer held. Not everything runs on military time. Alexander could see the rage flash across Sullivan's face. Interesting, there was tension between them. He filed that away as potentially useful. The first rumble of engines emerged from the forest, Ghost Convoy. Right where he'd predicted. 3 black trucks running dark, using the terrain for cover. They planned this well, but they hadn't planned for Alexander. All units. Hold position, he whispered. Wait for my signal. The next few minutes were crucial. The buyers were approaching from the north. Ghost's convoy from the south. Sullivan and Trevor stood exposed in the middle, waiting to oversee the exchange. One wrong move would send them all scattering. Alexander watched through his scope as Ghost's trucks emerged from the tree line. The lead vehicle's headlights flashed twice, a signal. The buyers' SUVs responded with their own flash. The trap was about to close, but not the one the wolves had planned. Command. I'm moving to position 2. Alexander whispered, wheeling silently through the shadows. His chair's custom suspension handled the rough terrain perfectly, keeping him stable as he positioned himself behind a stack of lumber. He could see everything now, the buyers approaching cautiously, Ghost's convoy rolling in from behind, Sullivan and Trevor in the middle of it all. The pieces were in place, years of planning, months of undercover work all coming down to this moment. Sir, a new voice on the comm, we've got a problem. Second buyer group approaching from the east. Not part of the plan. Alexander's blood ran cold. A second group meant this wasn't just a sale. It was an auction. The wolves were playing both sides, driving up the price by making the buyers compete. It was clever, but it also meant twice as many armed hostiles about to converge on their position. Cooper, we need to move now. If those groups meet, this turns into a shooting gallery. Negative, Cooper replied. We don't have containment on the second group. Hold position. Alexander watched as the situation grew more volatile. The first buyer group had spotted the second, and hands were moving to weapons. Sullivan was shouting at Trevor, who had drawn his own gun. Ghost's convoy had stopped, caught in the middle. Then he saw it, the slight nod between Sullivan and the second buyer group. This wasn't just an auction gone wrong. It was a double cross. Sullivan was playing everyone. Cooper, he whispered. Sullivan's working with the second group. This is about to go hot. Before Cooper could respond, Sullivan drew his weapon and aimed it at Trevor's head. Did you really think I needed you people anymore? He snarled. You're just the delivery boys. My real partners are here now. The lumber mill erupted into chaos. The first buyer group opened fire, thinking they'd been set up. Ghost's convoy drivers scrambled for cover. Trevor's men started shooting at anything that moved. Alexander stayed perfectly still, his military training taking over. Let them fight each other. Let them thin their own numbers. The real trap wasn't the FBI surrounding them. It was the crossfire they'd created themselves. Through his scope, he watched Sullivan backing away from the firefight, moving toward a side exit. He wasn't surprised by the chaos. This was his plan all along. Let the gangs kill each other, take the weapons, and disappear in the confusion. Cooper, he whispered. Sullivan's making his move. Permission to engage. There was a long pause filled with the sound of gunfire. Finally, Cooper's voice came through. Do what you have to do. Just stay alive. Alexander smiled grimly, unlocking his chair's hidden compartments. It was time to show them what a disabled veteran could really do. The lumber mill had become a war zone. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as 3 different groups exchanged fire, their shots echoing off the metal buildings. Alexander moved through the chaos like a ghost, his wheelchair's dark coating blending with the shadows. Sullivan was heading for the eastern exit, thinking he'd orchestrated the perfect distraction. He was wrong. Alexander positioned himself behind a forklift, watching Sullivan's route. He moved like the soldier he used to be, staying low, using cover. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He was looking for threats at eye level. Nobody ever looked down. Team Bravo, maintain fire on the main group, he whispered into his comm. Keep them pinned down. I'm handling Sullivan. A bullet pinged off the forklift above his head. The first buyer group was spraying ammunition everywhere, more concerned with volume than accuracy. Amateur move, they'd run dry soon. Sullivan was 30 yards away now, moving between crates. Alexander did some quick math, trajectory, wind speed, distance. His modified rifle was perfectly balanced for chair-height shooting. The recoil compensator was designed for his unique position. He hadn't missed a shot in 3 years. Command. 3, 2, 1. The flashbang sailed through the air. Its arc perfect. It landed exactly where he'd calculated. 3 feet behind Sullivan. He noticed too late. The explosion was deafening. Sullivan staggered, disoriented. That's when Alexander made his move. His wheelchair could hit 30 miles per hour on flat ground. Silent as death, he crossed the distance in seconds, ramming directly into Sullivan's legs. The impact sent him sprawling, his weapon clattering away. What the? Sullivan blinked, trying to focus. His eyes widened as he recognized Alexander, the cripple from town. Alexander's first strike caught him in the throat. A modified knife-hand attack perfectly adapted for his seated position. Sullivan gagged, stumbling backward. Surprise, Alexander said coldly, blocking Sullivan's clumsy counterattack. His next hit targeted Sullivan's knee. He knew from experience how vulnerable legs could be. Sullivan went down hard. He was trained, but he'd never fought someone like Alexander. Every move Alexander had learned in the military had been rebuilt, redesigned for maximum efficiency from a wheelchair. Sullivan's experience was working against him. He kept trying to adjust for a standing opponent. Federal agent, Alexander announced, securing Sullivan's wrists with zip ties. You're under arrest. You're FBI? Sullivan laughed through his pain. They're really scraping the bottom now. Alexander tightened the zip ties deliberately. Actually, I'm the one who's been tracking your operation for 3 years. Those weapons you've been stealing, we've got every serial number, every buyer, every corrupt officer on your payroll. A burst of gunfire interrupted them. The firefight was intensifying. Trevor had realized Sullivan's betrayal and was leading his wolves in a full assault on the second buyer group. Cooper. Alexander called through his comm. Sullivan is secured. Moving to Phase 2. Copy that. Teams are in position. Hit them hard. Alexander zip-tied Sullivan to a support beam, then moved back toward the main fight. The wolves were caught between the two buyer groups, taking heavy fire. Perfect. He reached into his chair's hidden compartment and removed a small drone controller. 3 years of preparation had gone into this moment. Every shadow of the lumber mill concealed a surprise. All units, gas masks on, he ordered. Then pressed the button. Smoke canisters detonated simultaneously across the lumber yard, filling the air with thick white clouds. The wolves and buyers panicked, shooting blindly into the smoke. But Alexander could see everything through his tactical display. His wheelchair's modifications proved their worth as he moved through the chaos. The rubber-coated wheels were silent on the concrete, the reinforced frame deflecting stray rounds. He was a ghost in the smoke, striking and vanishing. The first wolf went down to a perfectly placed shot to the leg. The second caught an elbow to the solar plexus as Alexander glided past. Years of combat training combined with his unique perspective made him nearly invisible to the standing fighters. Contact left, someone shouted. The feds in a chair. A what? Trevor's voice was incredulous. Find him. But finding Alexander in the smoke was impossible. He designed his wheelchair to be virtually silent, its profile too low for traditional combat tactics. Every disadvantage they thought he had became an advantage. The smoke was starting to clear when he spotted Trevor trying to rally his men. He was shouting orders, attempting to organize a retreat. Not this time. Alexander moved into position, his rifle steady, one shot to disable, just like he'd practiced thousands of times. The round caught Trevor in the shoulder, spinning him around. Alexander. Cooper's voice was urgent in his ear. Second buyer group is making a break for it. They've got 3 crates of weapons. Not happening, Alexander replied. Already moving. His chair's electric motor could outpace a running man. Alexander knew the lay out of the lumber mill better than any of them. He cut through the warehouse, taking a route they wouldn't expect. The buyers would head for the south exit. It was the only way that seemed clear. But Alexander had prepared for this. Command. Execute Containment Protocol Delta, he ordered, wheeling into position. Let's show them why you don't underestimate someone just because they're in a chair. The night was about to get very interesting. The second buyer group ran straight into Alexander's trap. As they rushed for the south exit, motion sensors triggered automated barricades, sealing them in. Their confusion was evident as heavy metal gates slammed down, blocking their escape. What the hell? The group's leader spun around, searching for another way out. They had 3 crates of weapons, but nowhere to run. Alexander's voice came through hidden speakers surrounding them. Federal agents, drop your weapons and get on the ground. Instead, they opened fire, bullets ricocheting off metal walls. Alexander watched through his tactical display as they wasted ammunition on shadows. Poor choice, he muttered. Activating the next phase. The sprinkler system activated, but it wasn't water that rained down. A specially designed sedative mist filled the air. The buyers stumbled, their shots going wild as the drug took effect. Within seconds, half of them were on their knees. Control. South sector contained. Alexander reported, moving to his next position. How's the main fight? Cooper's response was tense. Trevor rallied some of his men. They've got ghost weapons convoy, and they're trying to break through the east perimeter. Alexander smiled grimly. Not for long. He wheeled silently through the warehouse, taking a parallel route to Trevor's group. His chair's custom suspension handled the debris-strewn floor with ease, keeping him stable as he moved into position. Through the gaps in the crates, he could see Trevor leading 6 wolves toward the east gate. They were dragging weapon crates, moving as fast as they could while carrying the heavy loads. Trevor's shoulder was bleeding from Alexander's earlier shot, but rage and adrenaline kept him going. This is impossible, he was shouting. One fed in a wheelchair can't be doing all this. Boss, we need to drop the crates. One of his men gasped. We're too slow. Touch those crates and I'll kill you myself. Trevor's voice was desperate now. This is our ticket to the big leagues. Alexander keyed his calm. Cooper, I've got eyes on Trevor. Moving to intercept. Be careful. Hayes. He's cornered and desperate. Alexander positioned himself at the end of the row, calculating angles. His wheelchair gave him an advantage they hadn't considered. He could shoot from underneath the storage racks, through gaps they'd never think to check. The first wolf went down with a shot to the leg, crying out in surprise. The second caught a round in the shoulder before they even realized where the fire was coming from. Down! Get down! Trevor screamed, finally dropping his crate. Find him! Alexander was already moving, circling to their flank. His chair's silent motor gave him perfect mobility while they crashed around like bulls in a china shop. He picked them off one by one. Non-lethal shots just like he'd trained. Trevor was the last one standing, spinning wildly, trying to locate Alexander. Show yourself, he roared. Face me like a real fighter. Okay. The word came from behind him. As he turned, Alexander's chair burst through a stack of empty boxes. Before Trevor could raise his weapon, Alexander was on him. His first strike caught him in the wrist, sending his gun flying. The second, a modified leg sweep he'd perfected, took out his knee. Trevor went down hard, staring up at Alexander in disbelief. How? You're just a... Alexander's next strike silenced him, a precise hit to the jaw that he'd practiced countless times. I'm the agent who just brought down your entire operation, Alexander said calmly, securing Trevor's wrists. And I did it all without standing up. Agent Hayes. Cooper's voice was urgent. We've got a problem. Sullivan's loose. Alexander's head snapped up. What? How? He had help. One of the guards was on his payroll. They're heading for the north loading dock. Alexander quickly zip-tied Trevor to a support beam. Not for long. This ends tonight. He moved through the warehouse with renewed purpose. Sullivan was the key to everything. The weapon source, the military connections, the corrupt officials. They needed him alive and talking. The north loading dock was the mill's highest point, overlooking the entire complex. As he approached, he could hear helicopter rotors in the distance. Sullivan had an escape plan. Cooper, I need backup at the north dock, he called. And someone get me eyes on that chopper. But as he reached the dock's entrance, something felt wrong. The door was open, but no guards were visible. Sullivan was too good a soldier to leave himself exposed like this. It was a trap, and Alexander was rolling right into it. The first shot caught his chair's armored backrest, proving his paranoia right. Sullivan had set up a kill zone, expecting Alexander to rush in, but he'd made one critical mistake. He still thought Alexander needed the chair to fight. Alexander smiled in the darkness. Time to show them what a disabled veteran could really do. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the loading dock, casting harsh shadows. Sullivan had positioned his remaining men well, 3 shooters with clear lines of fire, covering every apparent approach. But Alexander hadn't survived Afghanistan by being predictable. "Cooper, maintain radio silence unless emergency," he whispered. Going dark. He detached his chair's backup battery pack, a custom piece of equipment that looked innocent but contained enough explosive power to breach a steel door. Years of being underestimated had taught him to weaponize everything people assumed was medical equipment. The first guard never saw it coming. The battery pack sailed through the air, detonating against the wall behind him. The explosion wasn't lethal, but the concussive force and shower of debris sent him sprawling. More importantly, it drew everyone's attention up, exactly where Alexander wasn't. He was already moving, sliding from his chair into a practiced combat crawl. His upper body strength, developed through years of adaptation, let him move silently across the concrete floor. Sullivan's men were still staring at the explosion site, never thinking to look down. "Where is he?" one of them hissed. "He has to be in that chair." Alexander allowed himself a grim smile as he pulled himself behind a crate. People's assumptions about disability were always their weakness. The chair wasn't his prison. It was just one of many tools. Sullivan's voice carried from above. "Find him. That helicopter's our only way out." The searchlight swept back and forth, creating moving shadows that Alexander used for cover. He reached up to a hidden pocket in his tactical vest, removing 3 small devices that looked like gaming dice. Another custom design, electromagnetic pulse generators disguised as medical equipment. The first one rolled under the helicopter, its magnetic surface clicking quietly against the landing strut. The second and third followed different paths, positioning themselves around the loading dock's power distribution box. "Boss, we need to go." One of Sullivan's men was getting nervous. "FBI teams are closing in. Not without those weapons manifests." Sullivan growled. "They're our insurance policy. And not without putting that federal agent in the ground." Alexander triggered the EMPs. The loading dock plunged into darkness as the power died. The helicopter's electronics sputtered and failed, its rotors winding down with a whine. In the chaos that followed, Alexander made his move. He pulled himself up onto a loading pallet, using the height advantage. The first guard was 3 feet away, night vision goggles rendering him blind in the sudden darkness. Alexander's strike to his carotid artery was precise. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The second guard spun toward the center, but Alexander was already moving. He used his own momentum against him, a technique he'd modified from his Marine combat training. Alexander could target knees and ankles with devastating efficiency. The third guard went down hard. "It's a trap." The third guard's panic was evident. "He's not in the chair. His warning was cut off as Alexander's garrote wire caught him across the chest, pulling him down to his level. A quick strike to the temple ended his resistance. Sullivan's voice cut through the darkness. "Very impressive, Agent Hayes. Using your disability as a tactical advantage. But you've got it wrong. This was my trap." Lights suddenly blazed from hidden positions. Alexander found himself caught in multiple spotlights, temporarily blinded. As his eyes adjusted, he saw Sullivan standing on the loading dock's upper level, holding a tablet computer. "Looking for this?" Sullivan waved the tablet. "Every weapon shipment, every buyer, every corrupt official, all the evidence you spent 3 years collecting. Encrypted. Of course. The passwords die with me." Alexander stayed low, analyzing angles and distances. "You really think that tablet is your way out? The whole mill is surrounded." Sullivan laughed. "You still don't get it. Why do you think I let you track this operation for 3 years? Why do you think we let you get so close?" A chill ran down Alexander's spine as the implications hit him. "You knew." "Of course we knew. You think you're the first agent they've sent? But you were perfect." the disabled veteran, so determined to prove himself. Every move you made, every bit of evidence you gathered, it all went exactly where we wanted it. Alexander's mind raced. 3 years of investigation. All the evidence stored on secured servers, servers that someone else had access to. Your boss, Agent Cooper. Sullivan's smile was cold. He's been working for us from the start. Right now, he's wiping every server, eliminating every connection. By sunrise, none of this will have existed. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but they weren't FBI trucks. The engines were wrong, more of Sullivan's men. So you see, Agent Hayes, your greatest weakness wasn't your disability. It was your trust in the system. The same system that sent you to Afghanistan. That took your legs. That made you think you could make a difference. Alexander's hands clenched into fists. Everything he worked for, every piece of evidence, every sacrifice, all part of someone else's game. But Sullivan had made one critical mistake. He thought this revelation would break Alexander. You're right about one thing, Alexander said quietly, reaching for his final hidden weapon. The system failed me. That's why I stopped trusting it 2 years ago. Sullivan's smile faltered. What? Cooper wasn't the only one playing both sides. Every piece of evidence I sent him, copies went to someone else. Someone even you can't touch. Now it was Alexander's turn to smile. Did you really think a disabled veteran would trust the system that betrayed him without a backup plan? The real operation was about to begin. Sullivan's confident smirk faded as his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. What did you do? Check your secure servers, Alexander said calmly. Still positioned on the ground. Every single one. Sullivan's fingers flew across his phone, his expression growing more desperate with each swipe. Impossible. These are military-grade firewalls. And I had 3 years to crack them. Alexander replied. Everything you've done, every weapon you've sold, every official you've bribed, it's all being uploaded to every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the country right now. A new sound cut through the night, different helicopters coming in fast. Not Sullivan's backup, these were military birds. Those aren't FBI helicopters. Alexander continued. That's the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Remember them, Colonel? Your old unit. They're very interested in where their missing weapons went. Sullivan's face contorted with rage. Cooper, get me a secure line to Cooper. Now. He can't help you. Alexander pulled himself behind a crate as Sullivan's men started moving nervously. He's probably already in custody. See, while you were watching me feed information to Cooper, I was working with someone else, someone who's been hunting you longer than I have. The tablet in Sullivan's hand chirped. His eyes widened as he read the message. Director Chun, you're working with Internal Affairs? Alexander smiled coldly. For 2 years, every piece of evidence I collected went to 2 places, Cooper's compromised servers and Chin's secure ones. You were so busy watching the crippled agent. You never noticed the real investigation. Sullivan's last threads of control snapped. Kill him. Kill him now. His remaining men opened fire. But Alexander was already moving. He'd spent months memorizing every inch of this loading dock, practicing movements most people wouldn't think possible without legs. He flowed from cover to cover, using his lower profile to his advantage. 3 years of playing weak, he called out, drawing their fire. 3 years of letting you think I was just a broken veteran. Want to know the truth? He triggered his final surprise. Remote charges planted throughout the loading dock. Not explosives, but industrial magnets salvaged from the lumber mill's equipment. They activated with a powerful hum, and suddenly every weapon with metal components was yanked toward the walls. The truth is, he announced, I never needed the chair to fight. I chose it because nobody looks twice at someone they think is helpless. The loading dock had become a killing ground, but not the one Sullivan intended. His men's weapons were useless, pulled away by magnetic forces they couldn't overcome. And Alexander was a ghost among them, striking from below, using their own height against them. Director Chun has been building a case against you for years, he explained, taking down another guard with a precise strike to the knee. But he couldn't get close. Then I came along, the perfect cover. Who would suspect the disabled veteran? Sullivan frantically typed on his tablet, trying to stop the data upload. I can still delete everything? No, you can't. Alexander's voice was closer now. That tablet hasn't been connected to your real servers for months. It's just for show. Like everything else about your operation. The military helicopters were directly overhead now, spotlights flooding the area. Armed figures rappelled down on fast ropes, special forces operators moving with precise efficiency. You know what the saddest part is? Alexander emerged from the shadows, pulling himself onto a crate to look Sullivan in the eye. You actually thought my disability was my weakness, but it was my greatest weapon, because men like you can never see past it. Sullivan drew a hidden pistol, but Alexander was faster. His strike caught him in the wrist, breaking his grip. The second hit took out his knee, a move he'd perfected from his ground-based fighting style. As he fell, Alexander caught the tablet, securing it as evidence. Agent Hayes, a voice called from above. Director Chun sends his regards. The Special Forces team moved in, securing Sullivan and his remaining men. Alexander watched as they were zip-tied and processed, his part in the operation finally complete. One of the operators approached him, offering a hand. Need help getting back to your chair, sir? Alexander smiled, already pulling himself up, using upper body strength that would shame most athletes. Thanks, but I've got it. I always did. As Sullivan was led away, he turned back one last time. How? How did you fool everyone for so long? I didn't fool anyone, Alexander replied, settling back into his wheelchair. You fooled yourselves. You saw what you expected to see, a disabled veteran trying to prove himself. You never wondered why someone with my combat record would choose such an obvious cover. The first rays of dawn were breaking over the lumber mill as Alexander activated his chair's motor. 3 years of deep cover, playing the role they all expected, letting them underestimate him at every turn. But he had never been the victim they assumed. He had been the hunter all along. Dawn painted the lumber mill in shades of gold as federal agents swarmed the complex. Alexander watched from his wheelchair as Sullivan and his men were loaded into armored transports. Director Chun, a sharp-featured man in his 50s, approached him with a tablet displaying real-time data uploads. 17 corrupt officials identified so far, he reported. 3 federal judges, 4 state prosecutors, and 2 generals. Your evidence is bulletproof. Cooper, Alexander asked. Tried to run when the servers went live. Got caught at the Canadian border 20 minutes ago. Chen's expression was grim. 3 years of your life. Letting him think he was running you. That's dedication. Alexander adjusted his position, his shoulders tight from the night's combat. He wasn't running me. I was feeding him everything. What he thought he was deleting was actually being copied to your secured servers. He led us right to the top. Still, Chen watched as another transport pulled away. Living in this town, playing the defeated veteran, letting them mock you day after day. Most agents wouldn't have lasted a month. Alexander smiled slightly. Most agents wouldn't have seen the advantage. The wheelchair wasn't my weakness. It was my greatest asset. Nobody suspects the disabled veteran of being a threat. The local news vans were arriving now, drawn by the convoys of federal vehicles. Sophia's truck pulled up, and the cafe owner rushed over to Alexander. My God, she breathed. When you said you had a plan, I never imagined. All those times they harassed you at the cafe were exactly what we needed. Alexander finished. Every incident, every mockery, every threat, it all built their confidence, made them sloppy. Chief Anderson approached, looking both impressed and slightly embarrassed. Agent Hayes, we had no idea. Even those of us who knew you were FBI didn't realize the full scope. That was the point. Chief. Alexander turned his chair to face him. The town's reaction had to be genuine. Your officers had to treat me like any other disabled veteran. It made the wolves believe their own assumptions. More vehicles were arriving, military intelligence, ATF, even CIA. Sullivan's network had tendrils everywhere, and now they were all being exposed. Alexander's phone buzzed constantly with updates as operations launched across the country. taking down corrupt officials and arms dealers who thought they were untouchable. Director, a young agent called out. You need to see this. We found a hidden room in Sullivan's office. Looks like overseas connections. Alexander wheeled himself toward the office building, Sophia walking beside him. You know what this means. Sophia, you can't stay here now. Once this hits the news. I know. Alexander felt a twinge of regret. Despite everything, he'd grown fond of Crestwood, but the mission was always bigger than one town. The hidden room was a treasure trove of intelligence, maps marked with weapons routes, lists of corrupt officials still to be turned, plans for operations that would never happen now. On one wall, surveillance photos of Alexander himself, at the cafe, at the store, moving through town. Sullivan had been watching him from the beginning, thinking he was the hunter. He never figured it out. Chun mused, studying the photos. Even with all this surveillance, he never realized you were playing him, because he saw what he expected to see. Alexander picked up a photo of himself looking vulnerable in his wheelchair. That's the thing about prejudice. It blinds you. They were so convinced that the chair made me weak. They never questioned why someone with my combat record would choose such an obvious cover. A commotion outside drew their attention. The first news helicopters were arriving, cameras rolling as federal agents let out more suspects. The story would break nationwide within hours, a disabled veteran single-handedly bringing down one of the largest weapons trafficking operations in history. But Alexander knew this was just the beginning. Sullivan's arrest would shake things loose, make other operations nervous. His phone buzzed with a message from a secured line. Phase 2 ready when you are. Sophia noticed his expression. There's more. Isn't there? This isn't over. It's never over. Alexander replied, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Sullivan was right about one thing. The system is corrupt, but that's why we have to fight it from the inside. One operation at a time. He turned his chair toward the exit, already planning his next move. The wheelchair hummed softly as he moved, a sound that had become synonymous with approaching justice. Behind him, Sullivan's empire crumbled piece by piece. But in other cities, other corrupt officials were watching the news, feeling the first stirrings of fear. Because somewhere out there, a disabled veteran might be watching them too, waiting patiently, letting them believe their own lies about what made someone dangerous. The real work was just beginning.